From Westminster, Brussels and Greece, get the latest from BREXIT-Cast. Watch that in an hour. Once again, we've plenty to talk about now on BBC One with Fiona Bruce.
Tonight we're in Southampton. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Victoria Atkins, a trained barrister, Home Office Minister and the Minister for Women, post she held under Theresa May and now Boris Johnson, former Lord Chancellor who set up the Supreme Court, and a member of Tony Blair's government for 10 years, Labour peer Charles Falconer, Ed Davey, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats and former Energy Secretary in the coalition government, Sarkar, contributing editor for the online news website Novara Media and self-described communist, and associate editor of the Daily Telegraph, specialising in royals and politics, Camilla Tominey. Welcome to our panel, to our audience here, and of course to you at home. You can join in the conversation, you know how by now, using hashtag BBCQT on Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram. Right, let's get started with our first question tonight, which is from Rebecca Schofield.
Good evening. Is Boris Johnson losing his appeal?
I see what you're doing there, Rebecca. Charles?
Well, what appeal did he have to start with, is the question.
But I think you know where Rebecca's going with that.
I think I know where Rebecca is going. What's happening in the Supreme Court at the moment, it's impossible to tell whether he's losing his appeal. But what he has done is tell the public, tell the media, maybe tell the Queen, that the reason he's closed down Parliament for 5 weeks is in order to write a Queen's speech. When you have a Queen's speech, you have to move the furniture around a bit in Parliament. So there are lots and lots of public galleries put in so people can watch, and they move the chairs around in the House of Lords. It takes the staff in Parliament about 3 days to do that. He said it's taken me 5 weeks to write a speech. There's no reason why he should close down Parliament for writing a speech. Why is he doing it? To close down Parliament so they don't confront him with Brexit issues. If he can get away with it, he can close down Parliament except for 2 weeks a year, and that goes right to the heart of our democracy. So in answer to your question, I don't know whether he's losing his appeal, but I hope he is.
Well, can I ask you, because you set up the Supreme Court back in 2005. Is this where you thought it would end up?
I thought it would end up with very big constitutional questions coming there. And it's absolutely right that instead of big constitutional questions being dealt with by a committee in the House of Lords, they're dealt with by a body of people in a building that everybody recognises as a court. And it's a court that's going to decide this not by reference to politics, but by questions of law, because it's ultimately law that decides this, not politicians.
Camilla, Tominey, there have been some pretty strong words, haven't there? I'm sure you've been following it, as I have this week in the Supreme Court. We had Aidan O'Neill making the case against the government, saying what we have is the mother of parliaments closed down by the father of lies.
Yeah, and there's been some strong words, obviously, in the press as well, which, as a journalist, one has to take responsibility for. What the public makes of it, though, I don't quite know. We talk about Boris Johnson's appeal, and some of the polling this week suggests that his appeal to the public has gone up. And that may well be a consequence of the fact that he has chosen this path. That may be a consequence of the fact that there is a consensus among Leavers and, in fact, some pragmatic Remainers that this course was necessary because it appeared as if MPs were trying to take control of the process and try and overturn the referendum result. They were arguing that they were doing that because they wanted to take no deal off the table, but I think there are many people out there who suspect that it's about more of that, and it's not about no deal, it's basically about no Brexit. And therefore I think Boris is winning support in some quarters for his course of action because he feels that those who are trying to stop Brexit are being thoroughly undemocratic.
That first response there is exactly what the problem has been for the last 3 years with this democracy and this government. We have had Theresa May trying to get a deal and trying to deliver Brexit MPs wouldn't give her a chance. Boris Johnson comes in. The media, MPs haven't even given him one glimmer of hope or support. No wonder he's suspended Parliament to try and get us a good deal and actually do what the people were voting for.
But do you think it's as you discovered there, a lot of support for that. I am really frightened of a view that says the Prime Minister can just shut down Parliament because Parliament doesn't agree with the Prime Minister. What restraint would there ever be on the way that our democracy is run? And you've got a man like Boris Johnson who is constantly saying one thing and doing another, and you get no restraint at all. I am really worried about what you said, and I'm really worried that the audience seems to be much more behind you than they are behind me.
Let's hear some more from the audience. The woman in the striped suit.
Hi, I wanted to ask Victoria how much appeal Boris Johnson has for you as Minister for Women when he's used openly sexist and misogynistic language, and he's had an argument so loud with his girlfriend that the police had to be called.
Before we get to this, I'm just going to hear a bit more from the audience, if you don't mind. The man in the blue shirt.
Not with Boris's appeal with the public, but his appeal with the EU, which appears to be at an all-time low.
Appeal with... Sorry.
We've had quite a lot from you already. I'm just going to keep going. The woman in the purple top now.
I just wanted to say that the politicians lost their appeal with the public when the politicians stopped representing the public's views.
Victoria.
Well, I've got a double whammy there.
You have got a double. Well, let me remind you of the original question. Is Boris Johnson losing his appeal, which is obviously a sort of double entendre there, but we were talking primarily about the Supreme Court.
Well, I hope people will understand that as a minister, given that the judges are at the moment deliberating, I'm not going to be able to give any meaningful expression on how the appeal may have gone, how it's going to go. I say this, not least because, as Fiona has said, I used to be a barrister, and I know just how difficult it can be when judges are sitting down there discussing and deciding a point of law. It is a fool's errand to try and speculate as to what may happen.
You can't forecast what you think the vote will be, but you can tell us what you think about it. About the situation?
I think the situation is that the Prime Minister has prorogued Parliament to settle a new Queen's speech. Charles has described moving the furniture around. In fairness to the Prime Minister, I think he has a very exciting new domestic agenda. He wants to invest in the NHS. He wants to fight violent crime. He wants to invest in infrastructure and cut the cost of living.
Can I remind you of something that you said, Victoria? Is that all right? Well, hang on a minute. Because you said, I acknowledge, but it's about prorogation. I acknowledge the concerns of some constituents in relation to the prorogation of Parliament, but the overriding objective of this government must be to deliver what the majority of my constituents have voted for, which is what the man was saying here, namely to leave the EU. This is what you said earlier this month, which, when I read that, I thought, is that what you're saying the prorogation was for? To deliver leaving the EU, rather than the Queen's speech?
No, I think in fairness it was part of a longer article, and I do appreciate the fact that the prorogation has been tied up. Indeed, that's what the argument in the Supreme Court is about. But this prorogation, the Prime Minister's case has been made in the Supreme Court, is about the domestic agenda. And I think, he's a new Prime Minister. Having a new Queen's speech actually is the right thing to do, and setting the domestic agenda. There's an awful lot going on with Brexit. Brexit is really important, don't get me wrong, but there are so many other things in life that are important as well, and we're trying to put a focus on those issues whilst tackling this important issue of Brexit.
The man in the blue shirt.
Right, though, that Boris Johnson can decide to just ignore bills that have been passed. Himself and Dominic Cummings are seemingly making plans to keep the Supreme Court busy by appealing against the Benn Act. That's a law that's been passed. Does the Prime Minister get to pick and choose which laws he wants to follow?
Well, we don't know if he's actually going to be doing that yet.
And
he won't give a straight...
We don't know if that's where it's going to go.
He won't give a straight answer. He won't give a straight...
He suggests he might, but we don't know if that's where it's going to go.
He won't give a straight answer in any...
Hang on, let's hear.
He won't give a straight answer in any interview about the fact that he's going to abide by the bill. He will not give an answer. He's been asked repeatedly, will he abide by the bill? And he won't give a straight answer. So why should we?
Sarkar.
I mean, look, if the Prime Minister doesn't have to abide by the law, then why should any of us? I tell you, if he doesn't abide by the Benn Amendment, I'm going to go burgle my ex's house because clearly it's open season. On this question of the Supreme Court's ruling, I think that sometimes we get caught up in assigning the law a value of being able to make ethical judgments as well as legal ones. It might not be the case that this prorogation of Parliament was illegal. That doesn't mean that it's not undemocratic. It doesn't mean that it's not unethical. And while I have a great deal of respect for Gina Miller, I think there is sometimes this approach by some aspects of the Remain movement to draw for legalistic solutions to fundamentally political problems. And the fundamentally political problem is that a power-grabbing executive can suspend Parliament for nakedly political aims, and it might be legal. That's the deeper question there.
Ed.
I was glad Victoria said that she wants to wait till the judges have made their ruling and respects the independence of the judiciary. I just wish everyone in this government would respect the independence of the judiciary, because we shouldn't judge whether this is illegal or illegal, but we can say whether we think it was politically right or morally right. And for me, it was completely wrong. Our country is in the grip of a crisis, and this Prime Minister has lost every single vote since he became Prime Minister. He doesn't want Parliament to sit, and so he's shut down Parliament, just at a time when the people's representatives should be there holding the government to account. I think that is totally wrong, and I hope the judgment of the voters will be heavy on him and he will lose all his appeal to you.
Back there with the glasses.
With regard to prorogation, normally this time of year is actually 4 weeks of recess for conferences. So really, it's only 5 days.
Exactly right, and Labour and Lib Dems are both continuing their conferences, so they're obviously happy with
because
that.
What actually happens is a motion is put down to Parliament for the conference recess, and Parliament votes every year whether it should go into conference recess. That motion was not put down. And do you know why? Because MPs would have not have voted for it this year. The reason, because our country is in crisis. Boris Johnson knew that, and that's why he prorogued and didn't put the motion down as normally happens.
Let's hear a bit more from our audience. So now in the blue shirt now.
Did Boris Johnson not offer the opposition an election? Therefore, we would have the backing or none of the public. And if that had taken place, we wouldn't be in a situation where the Supreme Court is basically doing politicians' dirty laundry in public, making the country look a laughingstock.
It's not. That's a very, very unfair characterisation of what's happened, because it's very difficult to trust Boris Johnson in relation to what he says. And he offered an election, but he wouldn't say what date it was. And because he's been incredibly let me finish. Because he was so slippery about when the election was going to take place, he could have had the election, had it after the 1st of November, and thereby avoided any further debate about whether we should leave with no deal or not. So I think the Commons were absolutely right, and the Labour Party was absolutely right to say no unless there was a guarantee it was going to take place on the 14th or 15th of October, and Boris wouldn't give it.
Do you want to come back on that?
I think that if that option had been taken, then the public would have decided.
If that option had been taken, we might well be slipping out of the European Union without a deal at the moment.
Absolutely right.
Well, maybe some of the members of the public are OK with that. Second point, I mean, talking about trust and Boris Johnson, you worked for Tony Blair. We then had John Major's contribution to this today. And John Major is a Prime Minister who prorogued Parliament to avoid scrutiny of cash for questions. Where was the legal challenge when that happened?
There certainly has been quite a lot of comment about that. John Major clearly denies that's why he suspended Parliament. Victoria, just while we've got you here, I'm going to move off this in a moment, but before we do, we don't know how it's going to go with the ruling of the Supreme Court, but what is intriguing is that what the government has not done is ruled out proroguing Parliament again, should the ruling go against them.
As I say...
Is that what they may do?
So I please, I'm going to play with a very, very straight bat on this one and just say I can't comment further until the judgment.
But the government, but the government's not ruling out proroguing again. You can comment on that.
I appreciate that this, you know, as I say, taking it step by step. These are such uncharted territories. I mean, you heard today the government's
so you won't rule out proroguing again,
saying this is a minefield. Well, first of all, you'll appreciate I'm not at a level where I'm involved in any conversations of a constitutional nation, but you know, I must.
I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, Victoria, but give us your view. Would you support it or not?
I've got to play with a straight bat on this one. I'm so because this
is the opposite of a straight bat. Oh my God! More respect for you with your original quotation that Fiona read out, where you were honest about the reasons for prorogation, which is that they were nakedly political, because at least you were being straight with us. And now you've got to backpedal and say, no, it's for the Queen's speech, on a whole set of legislative proposals, which he doesn't have a majority for anyway. And now when a very simple question is put to you about, will Parliament be shut down again, you can't even say whether or not you would support it. You're elected to represent your constituency and to put your view across, not just be blindly loyal to Boris Johnson.
And the way frankly, one of the ways I can best represent my constituents who voted very strongly to leave is not to take advice from a Corbynista who describes herself as a communist.
At least I'm honest about who I am.
On this point, I am treading very, very delicately, quite deliberately tonight, because we are in the middle of this, as I say, uncharted territory, as was widely acknowledged in the Supreme Court today by Baroness Hell and others. And I appreciate it makes for, you know, frustrating interviewing and listening, but I've got to do the right thing at this point in time, which is why I say we must take this step by step, wait for the judgment, and then events will unroll from there.
OK, lots of hands up. We're going to move on to another question from Jake Rogan.
Hi, good evening. Have the Liberal Democrats become the most dangerous and extreme party in British politics?
Not necessarily words you'd normally, I would say, suggest associate with the Liberal Democrats. Camilla.
Well, the position that they now find themselves in, I find curious, this notion of Jo Swinson now pivoting fully to revocation the day after Brexit, for a number of different reasons. First of all, back in 2008, the Liberal Democrats are one of the most vocal proponents for holding an in-out referendum on Europe. We heard from Jo Swinson herself in the House of Commons calling for one with the former Chief Whip Mark Harper in conversation. She then said at the conference this week that David Cameron was wrong to have called it. Well, she campaigned for it. We then had the Liberal Democrats campaigning vociferously for a second referendum. They joined in people's vote marches to call for this new democratic mandate. And then she contradicted herself by saying that even if Leave won again, she would ignore the result, which, sorry to coin the cliche, is neither liberal or democratic. Now we're in this situation of revocation. Oh, and by the way, meantime, there is no democracy at all for the constituents in Tory or Labour areas who thought they were voting for one kind of MP, who's now switched to the Lib Dems, and even though one of the particular MPs herself signed an early day motion, Sarah Wollaston, that if you switch sides, you should immediately face a by-election, none of them have. So this is not liberal, it's not democratic, and I think you've really boxed yourself into a corner, Ed.
Ed, I'll come to you in a moment.
If Brexit doesn't happen, will democracy in the UK ever recover?
OK, we'll come to that. That's a big old question. The man here in the blue shirt.
I come from Christchurch, and in 1993, I helped campaign for the Liberal Democrats to win the by-election. And one of the reasons was because they would hold a referendum. I'm appalled by your stance now. You've lost your moral compass. I can't believe what has become of the party. You know, it's just morally corrupt.
The woman in front.
I think it's quite funny that the Liberal Democrats have just said that their new slogan is "Cancel Brexit." Isn't that kind of discrediting the will of 17.4 million people? And if so, why should we vote for that?
So you said had someone who campaigned for the Liberal Democrats very unhappy about this policy.
Well, let me help him. The Liberal Democrats have been clear in the referendum and since the referendum that we're against Brexit. We have campaigned to stop Brexit. And in doing so, we've wanted to ensure that that was done in a democratic way. So we have campaigned for... So we have campaigned for
That
people's vote.
cannot be the response you want to get when you say that.
Well, I'm going to continue because we did. It's true. We campaigned for a people's vote. We still want a people's vote. We want you, the people, to have the final say on whether Brexit should go ahead. And what we've said in the latest position is that if the other parties prevent that referendum from happening, which it looks like they don't want that referendum, you have to ask yourself why. If that people's vote doesn't happen and we have to have a general election, then if we win a majority, and I accept it would have to be a political earthquake for us to win majority, but if it happened, we believe we'd have a democratic mandate to stop Brexit on day one. And if you look at what happened in the European elections, we said every vote for the Liberal Democrats is a vote to stop Brexit. And what happened? We beat the Labour Party and the Conservative Party for the first time in a UK-wide election in 100 years. So we're clear, whether it's a European election or a general election, a vote for the Liberal Democrats is a vote to stop Brexit.
Now, I know there are Liberal Democrats in the audience. We've heard from one. And so I'm just wondering if any of you support the new policy, or if you're from any other party, if you support the policy. Yes. Man back there in the back, stuck his hand up.
Oh, no, I don't support the policy.
OK, hang on. Because Ed's quite embarrassing. Madam, you put your hand up as someone who supports policy. Let's hear from you. The woman in the glasses.
Yeah, I completely support his position because if it's the general election, everybody has a choice and we have to be able to choose to revoke Article 50. Now we have the knowledge of what is a Brexit and the knowledge that getting a deal is so difficult.
Victoria.
Brexit's got to be delivered. We've got to do this. We asked the British public for their view on whether we leave the EU or not. There were, frankly, spirited, I'm putting it nicely, campaigns on both sides. And the side I was on lost. But I accept the result of the referendum. And indeed, I've stood on election pledges that I would honour the result of the referendum. So we've got to deliver it. And what I think is interesting over the last few weeks is that the Prime Minister has absolutely shown his determination to deliver it. We've sped up with the development of no-deal planning, but also today, just today, we saw movement potentially with the EU on breaking this logjam of a deal. And what we now need to do, make
Actually,
this
can I ask you about that, Victoria? Because
reasonable way.
The government
we need the support.
Let me just ask you, Victoria, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the government put forward non-paper papers.
I know.
So I thought, well, I don't know what that is. I mean, is that these or what are they? And are you in on the plan?
So non-paper papers are apparently ideas that have emerged during conversations with various players in Europe, which they're putting forward for discussion. So I liken it to the question time format. Asking the questions and then we get to answer it.
Well, that's not a place where agreement is reached generally, is it?
But it's part of the negotiating process. This was always going to be incredibly tough.
What's the plan?
The plan is to put our arguments forward to the EU about the backstop in particular. The Prime Minister today has said that there are arrangements that are being put forward, and we want the EU to look at these seriously, to deal with us constructively, because I think we all want a decent, proper relationship with the EU once we leave it. And so this is why the negotiations for the deal are so important. And can I just say, and it's been raised already tonight, one of the problems through this process has been that members of Parliament who stood on election pledges to honour the result of the referendum, who have said that they don't want no deal, have then done everything they can to prevent or to not vote for a deal. And Parliament's been very good at saying what it doesn't want. We now need, please, to get together, look at the deal that the Prime Minister brings back and vote for it so that we can deliver Brexit.
Charles, the question was about the Liberal Democrat position. Let's just talk about the Labour position a minute, because that's become...
Do I not get an opportunity to...
You can talk about that as well.
Okay, that was the question.
OK, and then let's talk about
that than Labour's
position.
position.
No, that's a fair point. That's a fair point, Charles.
It's the same as your position was until 2 weeks ago, bro.
No, it's not.
I mean,
do you know, that's the first time on the panel I've had anyone called bro. Really kind of getting down with the kids. Do you want to get down with the kids, Charles? Come on.
I'd love to get down with the kids. It is tempting to treat the Liberal Democrat position as ridiculous for all the reasons that Camilla went through rather effectively, I thought. It's changed and jumped around. I worry, though, that it is quite dangerous because, in effect, what it involves saying is we want to revoke the decision to leave when 17.6 million people have voted to leave. It shows such contempt, not just for the public, but contempt for democracy. And it makes me really worry about the Liberal Democrats. But it's completely of a piece. So the Liberal Democrats, laughingly so-called, ditch democracy in the hope of getting 2 percentage points in their opinion poll rating. And very large numbers of people in politics are now perfectly happy to ditch parliamentary democracy just to get Brexit. You will pay a terrible price if you are willing just to ditch Parliament in order to get a particular policy end. Imagine if you were a Leaver and it was a completely Remainer Parliament or a Remainer Prime Minister who decided he'd just close Parliament down in order to prevent leaving. It would be regarded as absolutely monstrous. And what is terrifying about the whole Brexit process at the moment is all the things that are most basic to our constitution are getting ditched just because of Brexit. And that's why that question about if we don't deliver Brexit, is it really dangerous? The answer is yes. We've got to deliver Brexit, and we've got to deliver Brexit with a deal.
And do you think that's... just looking at the Labour policy, which is going for negotiating a deal, then having a second referendum, we don't know if Labour's going to support the deal or not.
I mean...
Are you happy with that policy?
No, I'm not happy with that policy. I'm in favour of doing a deal, and I'm not in favour of the Boris posturing about no deal, which is pitiful. I'm not in favour of the Liberal Democrats saying let's revoke. I'm in favour of forcing the government, one way or another, to get a deal, and then we can move on from Brexit. And the pressure is going down and down from that because the Liberal Democrats have adopted this ridiculous policy of revoke, which means they presumably will not now support a deal. There are too many Tories who are willing to support no deal despite the damage done to the country by doing that. We need to find a way forward, and the only way forward is to respect the result of the referendum, but with a deal.
The Labour's position on this has been confused throughout, and you've just confused it yet again.
I'm not speaking for the Labour Party, I'm saying my own position, Ed, in relation to that.
You've confirmed
the Liberal Democrats to describe the position...
Hang on, if you both talk at once,
sorry,
no one can hear. No, Ed is making a point. Let's hear it.
You've had your turn.
OK. I apologise.
We have a very clear position, unlike the Conservatives' chaotic position and Labour's confusing position. And let's be clear, we would only stop Brexit on the back of a democratic mandate.
Which you're not going to get.
Our preference is for a referendum. But if Labour and the Conservatives conspire not to have that... No, let me finish. I'm telling you what the position is. If Labour and the Tories conspire not to allow that referendum, all we are saying is if at a general election we won that general election, we won outright and got a majority, we would use that power to stop Brexit on day one. If we didn't get a majority, we would work with other parties for a referendum.
I mean, I'm not being rude.
Confused.
I'm not being rude, but...
I think you're about to be, aren't you?
When the Lib Dems
You'd always call him bro again. We all run.
Come on, sis, hurry up.
When the Lib Dems say, oh, if we won a massive majority, we would cancel Brexit on day one, that's like me saying, if I was engaged to Anthony Joshua, I'd want a summer wedding. It's a lovely idea, but it's not going to happen.
Well, so
and so where you are, and the reason why I'm worried is because I think it is quite reckless of politicians to go to the public and say what you can do is take your first choice position, whether that's a no-deal Brexit or no Brexit at all, and write off the other half of the electorate. I think that's dangerous, I think it's reckless, and I think it's corrosive to democracy.
But that is just what the Conservatives have done. The Conservatives have failed to listen to the Remain side.
Wait, hang on. You are absolutely not going to paint me as some kind of closet Boris supporter here, all right?
I wasn't trying.
OK, so for me, the problem is that both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are saying to people, you can just write off the other half of the electorate. I think that's awful. I think that's what Labour is doing.
That's exactly what we're not saying.
I have been critical of Labour's position on and off through the last few years, is that what they're doing is that they're offering a democratic way through 3 years of government failure.
Ed, can I just ask very briefly, how many Liberal Democrat voters voted Leave? Because not all Liberal Democrat voters are kind of metropolitan Remainiacs. So what do you do with your own voters?
But Camilla, you can say that about...
Who voted Leave?
There were a lot of Conservative voters...
I'm not interested in that. Have you got the answer to that question? Have you got the answer to that question?
This issue goes across party. We all know that. And there are Conservative voters who voted Remain. Indeed, a lot of them are now voting Liberal Democrat because they're so unhappy with the complete chaos the Conservatives have made. And the Conservatives threaten both economic chaos and now they're delivering political chaos by shutting down Parliament. And actually, Charlie is right. Charlie is right. The undermining of parliamentary democracy should worry many, many people.
Ed, how many Liberal Democrats did vote Leave? I'm just interested. Do you know?
How do I know? You can't know that, can you?
But some did, right? So what happens to them now? They supported you. They supported you at the last general election. Are you just abandoning them?
Of course not. And I'll tell you one thing about...
Of course you are. Of course you are.
There are many, many people who believe that Brexit needs to come to a head. Either way. I have spoken to Leave voters, Liberal Democrat Leave voters, Conservative Leave voters. Of course they exist. and these people, what they want above all, they don't actually really care about Leave and Remain overall. They care about the health service, they care about schools, they care about the police service. And what they're saying to us is, whatever happens, just get it done, just move on, so we can get on with our lives and we can get rid of this appalling Conservative government.
Right, let's hear a bit from the audience. There's so many hands up. The woman here with the scarf.
Ed Davey, how you can have the hypocrisy to say what you do when it is Parliament who has caused the chaos. It is not the Brexit voters, it is not the Conservative Party, it is people like you. You asked for the referendum in 2008. Are you saying now that having canvassed for the referendum in 2008 on the Lisbon Treaty, you would have voted against your own canvassing? Would you have respected that result? No, Mr. Davey, you have to understand that we're all looking at you as hypocrites. You have a tranche. You were in coalition with the government that legislated for the referendum, and you were quite happy to take your seat at the top table with the Tories between 2010 and 2015. You were in bed with that party. You were quite happy to see us voting on Lisbon, where, by the way, Article 50 wouldn't have even existed post that referendum, and we would have been out if we had been given the referendum. So to stand there and say there is chaos in Parliament, it is you who is causing it.
It's absolutely not. Can I answer that? That's a very, very important
yes, absolutely.
We started off this Parliament with 12 Liberal Democrat MPs. We've now got 18. I don't know. I don't know about your maths. I don't know about your maths. But in order to stop the government, you would have to have a large number of people to stop the government. What has happened? Brexit hasn't been delivered because the Conservative Party couldn't agree what Brexit meant. And it's the Conservative Party divided, fighting amongst itself and with the DUP. And that's the reason Brexit hasn't been delivered, not because of us.
Yeah, but Brexit doesn't mean Remain, does it?
No,
that's the difference.
And I never stood on a manifesto for Brexit.
To save this turning into a question time entirely about the Liberal Democrat policy, because there were a lot of questions about that. There are also questions about other things. I'm just going to move on for a moment, if I may. Before I do, I'm going to tell you where we're going to be next week, in case you'd like to come and join in. Look what fun it is. Why wouldn't you? So next week, we're going to be in Cardiff. So come along there. We'll be broadcasting for the Welsh Assembly, the Senedd, and the following week, we are in Wallasey, which is near my old stomping ground, actually. So if you want to be in the audience, call 0330 123 9988. Or, as you know, you can go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. So, let's change the subject for a moment. Declan MacDonald.
If the Prime Minister cannot see the press, how can he be expected to see other problems within the NHS?
Going on there, Victoria? It was yesterday, wasn't it? So the Prime Minister was at a hospital and he was talked to in fairly strong terms by a person at the hospital, and he said, "Oh, there are no press here." Of course, that comment was being filmed by the press. So what was that all about?
Well, first of all, I think it is really great. You know, we often, politicians get criticised because we're out of touch or we're not listening to people. You have here a Prime Minister who is out and about the country, talking to people, having very, very, sometimes very frank exchanges with them, but he's listening to people. And he was at the hospital yesterday to look at what the particular needs of that hospital were, but also to speak to all the people that work in the NHS there. And actually, this is on top of the fact that we're investing, by the end of 2023, we're going to be investing something like £33 billion more in the NHS. We've just pledged further money, more than £1 billion more in hospital upgrades. And I think it's really good that the Prime Minister is out there talking to people. Now, I don't know what went through his mind. I would say this, though.
It's called a lie.
God, have a guess.
No, I would say this, though, actually. Any Prime Minister is surrounded constantly by cameras in a way that we can't imagine, even though we're in the political world. And I don't know what happened. He had in front of him clearly a gentleman who was very upset, and we know now his child was very sick. And I don't know, just on a human level, I can't see into the Prime Minister's mind, but I think actually, if you look at the footage filmed by the press, you will see actually he was trying to relate to him on a human level, and I think it's that human touch that Boris does reach across to people, and I think it's something to be commended that our Prime Minister is out there talking and listening.
Number of hands up, the man in the blue shirt.
I'd like to ask, where's this money coming from now? You know, a few months ago, this money tree was invisible. But now, all of a sudden, there's billions of pounds being promised to the NHS, to different areas of the community, and you've got to think this is all about an election.
We have got... we have had some... We had some really difficult decisions to make at the beginning of the 2010 decade. We inherited an economic mess from Labour, where we were borrowing... If I just remind us of the facts... If I just remind you of the facts, we were borrowing £1 of every £4 we spent. Today, we are borrowing £1 of every £33 we spend. So we've made huge progress as a country, and I very much appreciate, there have been some very, very difficult decisions that have been made. But we're now in a position when we've got some more headroom. And I think it's absolutely right that we're investing more in our NHS, we're recruiting more police officers, we're investing in our schools.
Turn that on in the snap of a finger.
Okay.
How can you turn that on? Billions.
Let's let other people on the panel answer as well.
Can I just come in on this? Because austerity was not just a bloodless balancing of the books. It was paid for with people's lives. 120,000 people. And the reason why I'm so angry, and the reason why I think that gentleman yesterday was so angry, is because those of us who rely on public services, whether it's the NHS, whether it's the education system, whether it's child protection, whether it's benefits, have had to endure suffering for a decade while we've heard the same line repeated by Tory MPs about having to, end the deficit and how tough choices there are to be made. You didn't have to pay for those choices the way ordinary people did.
Did you...
I think our Prime Minister has a problem recognising the truth. And he has a track record more seriously, it was John Humphrys' last day on the Today programme, and he was talking about how politics has changed and how the political interview has changed. And I thought something really caught my eye. He said that Boris Johnson has not been on the Today programme to be interviewed in the way that previous Prime Ministers used to be interviewed. Actually, Jeremy Corbyn hasn't been on the Today programme to be interviewed the way previously the opposition used to be interviewed. And I think this is a really worrying trend. I think politicians are turning far too quickly to the social media, a bit like Donald Trump putting out his tweets. And I think that is preventing a mature political discourse where politicians who are leaders, be they Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn, ought to be able to face that level of scrutiny so we can listen to them, and our top press people, people like John Humphrys, can give them a grilling on our behalf. And the fact that Boris Johnson is not doing that is what worries me the most. And until he gets onto the Today programme and actually puts his neck on the line, I don't think we can trust him at all, particularly on the NHS.
So, Charles, Declan's question is, if the Prime Minister can't see the press, how can he be expected to see the problems within the NHS?
I mean, it's so true that. I mean, the person who was talking to him had a 7-day-old baby, and he'd had to wait hours to see a doctor. The management of the hospital confirmed that was indeed the case because there was a shortage of doctors because there was a problem in the hospital, an emergency, which meant there weren't enough doctors. That was the problem in the NHS, which the individual father was incredibly agitated about. The way that Boris Johnson responded was not to ask about the problem. It was, in order to get himself out of a mess, to tell an immediate lie. This is the person that the Supreme Court are being asked to trust, but perhaps more importantly, this is the person that the EU are being asked to trust to do a deal with. And he is such a compulsive liar and people pleaser that the chances of the European Union trusting him are very, very low indeed. And I was really struck by Victoria's answer. Victoria, as you know, is a trained and incredibly competent and able barrister, therefore used to defending people who tell lies. And what did she say? I can't think what was going through his mind at the time. A rather telling answer, I thought.
Charlie, hang on a minute. I'm not reminded. Forgive me, Charlie, but aren't you also a lawyer and a QC who some might accuse in your former role as the Attorney General under Tony Blair of telling lies for him?
I am a QC. I was never an Attorney General.
But you were a QC.
I never. I'm not suggesting Victoria told a lie. What I am suggesting about Victoria's defence, it was the sort of defence that indicates, well, actually, there's nothing to be said on behalf of this man.
But you're a lawyer as well, and you're arguing for lawyers to take a role in politics, which is another subject we've covered.
But we're talking about the NHS at the moment.
The NHS. I think the response that Boris Johnson had to the chat with the daughter was because he had said, and you just come down here for a press opportunity. And I think he used that. He mentioned the press. It was a lie, wasn't it? Well, the BBC were there.
Was it a lie?
Yeah. I mean, of course the press were there.
Told a lie.
But I don't know whether it was a massive press pack or whether it was just the BBC.
It was one camera because
so
pool
it was either
for
a
the
tiny
older
lie
media.
or a much bigger lie.
I've just said it was a lie. I've just said it was a lie. I've just said it was a lie. I'm not working on behalf of the government here, dudes.
Dudes?
Yes.
Dudes.
We are just really trying to get so cool tonight.
I'm just inspired by
Anne. It's a cool programme.
Having
I'm so
said
sorry
that,
for lowering the tone.
I know, I love the lowered tone. But the point is as well, I think, on the NHS is let's not completely malign the NHS and talk about this kind of...
Nobody was maligning
Well, there was a kind of little bit kind of hysterical, the NHS and waiting times and everything. I mean, in the last decade, I've had 3 children on the NHS. I've had a wonderful experience of the care. I'm a GP's daughter. My stepmother's a pharmacist. I mean, I've grown up in a medical family and revered the NHS. The NHS has always needed more investment. Successive governments, Labour and the Conservatives, have tried to plough more money in. There could be an argument for some kind of root and branch reform, some sort of overhaul to make it more efficient. Nobody wants to hear about doctor and nurses shortages, putting a parent in that kind of desperate situation, and who could fail to have sympathised because he had a young daughter who was in trouble overnight. But sometimes we can get into discussions whereby it seems as if everything's in chaos, and actually I think the NHS is doing a marvellous job for the vast majority of people.
I want to take a question from Christopher Hart.
In the UK, suicide is the main cause of death in young people under 35. I'd like to ask the panel why they think that is, and what does it say about our society?
And Christopher, can I just ask, since you've asked this question, is there a reason for you asking this question?
Well, tomorrow is a year since my 16-year-old daughter took her own life. So,
I'm so sorry.
I'd like some answers and some action.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking the question. I suspect that wasn't easy. What does it say about our society? Ash, actually, is the youngest person on the panel.
So mental health is something which is really close to my heart. It's something which members of my family who I'm very, very close to have struggled with, and I've seen those problems deepen over very many years. And I think there's no one cause for it. There are multiple causes to it. I think one is that mental health services simply are not funded enough. They need more manpower. They need more resources. Two is that there is still so much stigma attached to reaching out and to talking and to seeking help. It's something which is very difficult to do, from the age when you're at school right through to when you're at working age. Those things are all very, very difficult. And then I think a third aspect of it, and I think this is also why it's something which affects people who are younger, is that at the moment it feels like fundamentally the social contract has broken down, and if you're young, you're stuck in precarious work, low-wage work, you're sort of surrounded by this constant sense of anxiety and crisis, and it's very, very difficult to feel hopeful. And these are the sorts of very complicated, knotty problems that I wish I saw politicians wrestling with in Parliament day to day. And unfortunately, these are the issues that get sidelined.
Can I ask you, because this obviously will have dominated your thoughts for the last years, what's your view on this?
Well, it doesn't help when MPs block debates regarding suicide. It doesn't help when you've got democracy being destroyed and the kids of this world and the young people are seeing what's going on. I mean, whichever way you voted, the position, the mess we're in is because there's so many people out there trying to destroy democracy and they're claiming they're fighting for it. And it's just appalling. There's so many aspects of the society which is completely wrong. And we need to raise the awareness as much as anything. I think in order to save lives and stop this from happening, the first thing is to raise the awareness and be brave enough to take it head on rather than be sort of sweeping it aside because we're uncomfortable with it.
Well, you've been brave enough to mention it tonight. Charles, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, first of all, can I pay a tribute to your courage in bringing forward? It is unimaginable how brave you've had to be to raise it like this. Secondly, the reproof you gave to us politicians is very well made, which is we're bickering about a problem, Brexit, democracy, etc., which we're not solving because whichever side you're on, we've produced no solution, whilst the sorts of experience that you have just gone through go completely ignored, which is shaming for the politicians. And then thirdly, why is it happening? Well, Ash is obviously right, there's not enough mental health care, but also the point that, and I see it from having children of my own, the pressures on children, the isolation of children from their families, the demands made and the greater sense of failure make the pressures on people when they are adolescent absolutely appalling, and we can't imagine, and we are often not told what they are going through, and so it is not surprising that they need support which they cannot get at the moment.
The young man there.
I think as a young person, I mean, I've dealt with issues with mental health for years now, and there's always going to be different causes, there's always going to be different problems, but the problem is there isn't help when you actually need it, right? I can sit on a waiting list for 6 weeks, but in that time, my problems jumped off a cliff. Yeah, it's got so much worse, where it could be dealt with so much easier and so much quicker if we actually got that help straight away. I mean, I've been in and out of the system 4 times now. On the NHS, I haven't seen anyone. I haven't heard a phone call from them for 8 months. We had to go private in the end for insurance, but after my 8 sessions, we can't afford any more. It doesn't matter if I need help past 8 sessions, you just don't get it. And all of these problems are caused because no one's putting any money in to actually help us when we really need it. It's always being left until it's too late, until people are jumping off bridges, until people are taking overdoses.
Victoria, I remember talking to David Cameron 3.5 years ago, I think it was, and he looked in the eye and said, and repeated a pledge he'd made several years earlier, which is that mental health problems will be treated on a par with physical health. And from what we're hearing there, and from the evidence, it's just not happening.
I think, am I right in understanding that this area is served by the Southern Health Trust, the Mental Health Trust? I mean, that trust has had particular problems and has not, I think, served its community and you well. We are investing far more in mental health provision. I can appreciate it doesn't feel as though that has it's reached the ground, particularly at the moment with the troubles you've had with the trust. But this genuinely has been a priority for the last Prime Minister and this Prime Minister. We now have a minister appointed for suicide prevention precisely because we are so worried about the impact, particularly on young people, that mental health is happening. And I'm not, please don't think I'm not speculating as to the reasons behind it. I wouldn't dream of prying. But we know that there are certain societal issues that are placing so much of a burden on our young people that we, frankly, didn't have when we were growing up. Ash may be glaring at me, but in terms of the pressures of social media, because I think that we know is very often a factor in helping with the helping create the conditions where young people feel so in need of help. And I think we've got to find a way of grappling with that factor as well as many, many other factors.
Young man in the red shirt.
I think it's worth remembering that when young people go to seek help for mental health issues, they're often put on a waiting list. And if you tell a young person who's come to you and, confess something they've been worried about, that they're going to be on a waiting list, they see that as no one really cares at the moment. There's other people out there who have more important issues than me. And I think that might be contributing to why they then go down that road and they're reluctant to seek out more help.
Man in the dark blue shirt.
I've got a daughter as well, and I can't imagine what the gentleman's been through, but the big issue is the stigma, the awareness, and my daughter's at school, and I cannot believe the amount of friends that are having problems, mental issues, which are just glossed over, and I think there needs to be a lot more just immediate response, and it's been echoed many times that if people have issues, they're on a waiting list, and I think things could be different if there was more immediate action to this and recognise that mental health is not a little small issue in your mind. It needs to be recognised as an equal thing as to breaking your leg, anything.
Man in the black and white shirt here.
I think sometimes it's even about educating the GPs and stuff. When I personally had the experience that I've had with mental health, you can see I shake, but the shake has nothing to do with my mental health, but everything, I was being prescribed everything you can imagine for depression and things like that. Nobody would listen to the fact that, I was scared. I was scared, and I just needed somebody to talk to work through it. It wasn't a case of chuck pills at me and things like that. That didn't help. I didn't actually get any better until I came off the medication. I felt that they kept me down. But you're suicidal, and all of a sudden the doctor's throwing lots of pills at you. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think we need to talk first.
On that point of medicalisation, I think with a lot of more complicated cases, and I think mental health is one of them, that time is a factor. And if people go to the GP is there and it's not their fault. They're thinking, I've got another 19 patients to get through before lunch and I can only give them 5 or 10 minutes. And I've discussed this with my father because he said if he'd have difficult patient, he'd leave them to the end of the day and give them some time, but they were back in the days when my dad would go out on call to people's houses and work at the weekend. That's one factor. Second of all, a lot of mental institutions were closed down, and they were closed down because they were Victorian and they were not appropriate to current standards. And I know that because, God rest her soul, my grandmother was in one and had electric shock therapy and all of these really barbaric treatments which you wouldn't dream of carrying out on any patients now. But I think we have to ask ourselves what that's been replaced with. And of course there is care for people in the community, but there isn't that instantaneous place for people to go who are really in crisis. And equally, people are being left to be in crisis. They're being left far too late. It's not just a mental health care problem, by the way. It's also an issue with people who are suffering from addiction issues. And they're only really helped when they're at rock bottom, whereas you want a system where people are helped before they even get there.
Ed.
I think we owe a gratitude to Christopher for raising the question, because the more we talk about it, the more we raise awareness of it, the better. And we've heard from the audience about the waiting lists. We need to have early intervention. The earlier that people can be assisted, the better. And in my constituency, I've been deeply alarmed meeting a lot of parents in my advice surgeries where their children are waiting for months to go to the child and adolescent mental health services. And it is absolutely being rationed because of the budgets, and it's a massive problem. And you're right, David Cameron did promise that mental health would be treated on a parity with physical health, but that required the money to flow with it, and it hasn't happened. And one idea that we've been thinking about in the Liberal Democrats is to borrow an idea from New Zealand. And the new Prime Minister in New Zealand has said, look, when we're setting our budgets and our economic policy, should we simply just talk about economic growth? Well, actually, people, what they really care about is happiness, is their well-being. And New Zealand are reshaping their budgets to develop what they're calling a well-being budget. And do you know what that has done in the first year of it? It's switched a lot more money into mental health care. So if we are really serious about it, we should do, from the very heart of government, reshape the whole way we think about spending money to make sure the money is really going to the things that people need.
Christopher, I just want to give the last word to you, actually, on what you've heard so far. You've decided to come here tonight, clearly, and say your piece on such a desperately difficult anniversary.
Well, there's organisations out there, like Papyrus, for instance, which is the National Suicide Prevention Charity, and I think they need to be involved a lot more in the discussion, people like that. And I think there needs to be a lot more support from the media and politicians, because although I believe that the media and politicians are actually a little bit part of the problem, they can also be part of the solution as well. And I think they just need to be brave enough, and particularly environments like the sports environments within the media can be very powerful in getting this message across, providing support and letting people know it's okay to talk and pick up the phone. And yeah, that's how things should be, I think, as we start.
Thank you for your contribution. And actually, for those of you who've spoken so frankly and openly about your own mental health issues, who would have imagined, I don't know, 3 years ago, even 5 years ago, that we would have had that kind of conversation and that people would have felt they could be so open about it? Personally, I'm sure I speak for everyone, I think it's tremendous that we can do that and we can have that kind of conversation. Our time is up, I'm afraid. Our next programme, let me remind you, is in Cardiff. The following week we will be in Wallasey. So I'm sure you know the number by now, but it's 0330 123 9988. If you'd like to come along and be in the audience, you can go to the Question Time website, you can follow the instructions there they are. And if you want to carry on this conversation and have your say on tonight's topics, you can join Adrian Charles on guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that is on 5 Live now. But for now, thank you very much to my panel, to all of you here for coming tonight and making your points so cogently and so brilliantly and talking so frankly, and to you at home for watching and listening. From Southampton, bye-bye.
on this week's box office hit, the UK Supreme Court Brexit cast returns to BBC One in just a moment.
Lord Suggs.
All right, get on with it. Come on.
Let's take our relationship with the